Your wife is cheating on you. Black Waitress gives Billionaire a note that leaves him frozen. What if a single folded napkin could shatter everything you believed about love? Gerald Morrison had built an empire worth $3 billion, but nothing had prepared him for what happened on that quiet Tuesday morning at Rosie's diner. He sat in his usual corner booth, the same spot he'd occupied every Tuesday for 6 months, watching the rain streak down the window while his coffee grew cold. The elegant silver wedding band on his finger caught the dim light as he scrolled through his phone, checking stock prices and merger reports. He thought he was just another successful businessman grabbing breakfast before heading to the office. But Ruby Washington, the soft-spoken waitress who'd been serving him black coffee and wheat toast for months, was about to change his life forever. She approached his table with trembling hands, a small piece of paper folded carefully between. Her fingers, her kind eyes filled with the weight of a secret she could no longer carry alone. "Where are you watching from today?" Gerald Morrison wasn't supposed to be the kind of man who ate at roadside diners. His usual haunts were exclusive country clubs and 5-star restaurants where waiters wore white gloves and knew his name. But 6 months ago, after a particularly brutal board meeting, he'd taken a wrong turn on his way home and stumbled into Rosie's diner. Something about the warm yellow light spilling from its windows and the gentle hum of conversation inside had drawn him in like a moth to flame. Ruby Washington had been his waitress that first day, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. She'd served him coffee without asking if he wanted cream, somehow knowing he preferred it black, and had never once asked for an autograph or mentioned his wealth. Their relationship had settled into a comfortable routine. Every Tuesday at 9:30 sharp, Gerald would slide into booth number 7, and Ruby would appear with his coffee before he'd even removed his coat. They'd exchange pleasantries about the weather or her grandson's Little League games, but never anything too personal. Gerald found these moments oddly comforting, a brief respite from the corporate world, where every smile had an agenda and every handshake came with a price tag. Ruby treated him like any other customer, with kindness, but without the fawning attention he'd grown tired of in his regular circles. But today felt different. Ruby's usual bright smile seemed forced, and her hands shook slightly as she poured his coffee. She kept glancing toward the kitchen, then back at him, as if wrestling with some internal debate. Gerald noticed the way she lingered by his table, longer than usual, refilling his cup even though it was still half full. When she finally worked up the courage to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Morrison, there's something I need to tell you, but I don't know how." She clutched her order pad against her chest like a shield. "It's about your wife." Gerald's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. In all their months of pleasant small talk, Ruby had never mentioned his personal life, let alone his wife Victoria. The diner suddenly felt too quiet, as if every other conversation had stopped to listen. He set down his cup carefully, his business instincts kicking in to maintain composure even as his heart began to race. "What about Victoria?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ruby's dark eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and fear, the kind of look a mother gives when she's about to deliver news that will hurt her child. "She comes here sometimes," Ruby said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other customers were listening. "Usually on Thursday afternoons when it's slow, always sits in that booth over there by the window." She nodded toward a corner table that Gerald had never paid attention to before. "She's not alone." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and suffocating. Gerald felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar sensation he remembered from his childhood when his father would come home late with lipstick on his collar and lies on his lips. Ruby reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded so many times it looked like she'd been carrying it for days. I wrote down what I saw because I couldn't sleep at night, knowing and not telling you. You're a good man, Mr. Morrison. You tip well, you're polite to everyone, and you always ask about my grandson. You don't deserve to be played for a fool." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Gerald could see the genuine care in her eyes. This wasn't gossip or malice. This was a woman who'd watched him sit alone in this booth for months, drinking his coffee and checking his phone, completely unaware that his 30-year marriage was crumbling, while he focused on mergers and acquisitions. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Gerald's hands trembled as he reached for the paper, knowing that once he unfolded it, there would be no going back to the comfortable illusion he'd been living in. "Who is he?" he whispered, though part of him already feared he knew the answer. Ruby's next words hit Gerald like a physical blow. "It's your business. In partner, Mr. Davidson, Richard Davidson." The paper slipped from Gerald's fingers and fluttered to the table like a dying bird. Of all the names Ruby could have spoken, this one cut the deepest. Richard Davidson wasn't just his business partner, he was his oldest friend, the man who'd been best man at his wedding, who'd held Gerald's hand in the hospital when their first child was stillborn, who'd been like a brother for over 30 years. Gerald's mind raced through 1,000 small moments that suddenly made terrible sense. Victoria's new interest in afternoon shopping trips that lasted hours. Richard's increased absences from important meetings. The way they'd both seemed unusually interested in Gerald's Tuesday morning routine, always asking casual questions about where he went and when he'd be back. The elaborate anniversary party Victoria had thrown last month, where she'd made a beautiful speech about their enduring love, while Richard stood applauding in the crowd, both of them knowing it was all a lie. "How long?" Gerald asked, his voice barely audible. Ruby sat down across from him without being invited, a gesture so maternal it almost broke his heart. 3 months, maybe 4. I kept hoping it would stop, that maybe I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. But last Thursday," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "they were holding hands across the table, and she was wearing a necklace I'd never seen before, a heart-shaped pendant. He kept touching it while they talked, like he'd given it to her." Gerald closed his eyes and saw Victoria clearly now, remembered her wearing that exact necklace to dinner just 2 weeks ago. When he'd complimented it, she'd smiled and said it was a gift to herself for their anniversary. The betrayal felt like drowning in reverse, water filling his lungs while he sat perfectly still in a diner booth. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Ruby reached across the table and patted his hand gently. "I'm so sorry, honey. I know this hurts something fierce, but you needed to know." Gerald nodded, grateful for her kindness, even as his world collapsed around him. He thought about all the times he'd worked late, missing dinners and anniversaries to build the empire that was now funding his wife's affair with his best friend. Gerald sat in that booth for another hour after Ruby had gone back to work, staring at the unfolded note that contained dates, times, and careful observations written in Ruby's neat handwriting. Each entry was like a dagger. Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Davidson, holding hands, shared dessert 2:30 p.m. Saw them kiss in parking lot Thursday 3:15 p.m. He paid for lunch with credit card, called her darling. Ruby had documented their affair, with the thoroughness of a court reporter, but also with the gentle care of someone who understood that behind every fact was a human heartbreaking. When Gerald finally stood up, his legs felt unsteady beneath him. He left a $100 bill on the table, more than 10 times what his coffee cost, and walked slowly to the door. Ruby intercepted him at the register, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. Gerald looked at this woman who had shown him more loyalty in 6 months than his wife had in 30 years of marriage. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but thank you for telling me. That took courage." Ruby squeezed his hand briefly. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Morrison. You're stronger than you think." Gerald drove home in a daze, his mind cycling between rage and heartbreak. When he pulled into his circular driveway, he saw Richard's car parked beside Victoria's Mercedes. For a moment, he considered turning around and driving away, but something Ruby had said echoed in his mind. "You're stronger than you think." He walked through his front door with steady steps, following the sound of laughter coming from his study. There they were, Victoria and Richard, sitting close together on the leather sofa, sharing what looked like champagne from Gerald's private collection. Victoria looked up as he entered, and for just a moment, guilt flashed across her face before she composed herself. "Gerald, you're home early," she said, standing up quickly and smoothing down her skirt. Richard remained seated, but Gerald noticed how his hand moved instinctively to straighten his tie. "We were just discussing the Henderson merger." It was such a pathetic lie that Gerald almost laughed. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Instead, he walked to his desk and sat down, pulling Ruby's note from his pocket. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think we need to discuss something else entirely." He placed the note on the desk between them and watched as both their faces went pale. The confrontation that followed was nothing like the dramatic scenes Gerald had imagined during his drive home. There were no shouting matches or thrown objects, just three middle-aged adults sitting in an expensive study, finally telling the truth after months of lies. Victoria broke down first, tears streaming down her face as she confessed that the affair had started during Gerald's business trip to Tokyo. Richard sat in silence, unable to meet his oldest friend's eyes until Gerald asked him directly why he'd betrayed 30 years of friendship for a few months of stolen afternoons. "I was lonely," Richard said finally, his voice thick with shame. "Susan and I have been having problems for years, and Victoria was lonely too. You're always working, Gerald, always traveling or in meetings or checking your phone. We just found comfort in each other." Gerald felt a strange calm settle over him as he listened to their explanations and apologies. The anger he'd expected never came. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying was finally lifting from his shoulders. The divorce proceedings took 8 months, but they were remarkably civil. Gerald kept the business, Victoria kept the house in Martha's Vineyard, and Richard moved to California to start over. Gerald found himself returning to Rosie's diner more often, not just on Tuesdays, but whenever he needed to remember what genuine human kindness looked like. Ruby never asked about what happened after that morning, but she always made sure his coffee was extra hot and his toast was perfectly golden. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Gerald did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He sold his majority stake in Morrison Industries and used the money to start a foundation that provided scholarships for single mothers like Ruby, who'd raised her grandson alone while working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The first scholarship went to Ruby's grandson, who wanted to study engineering. When Gerald presented her with the check at a small ceremony at the diner, Ruby hugged him tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you, honey. You turned your pain into something beautiful." As Gerald looked around the diner that day, seeing Ruby's friends and family celebrating this unexpected blessing, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of courage, like folding a difficult truth into a piece of paper, can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for joining us on Gerald's journey from heartbreak to hope. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places.